Sometimes the biggest hearts come in the most broken packages. When widowed mother Mercy Calder saw the giant cowboy chained in a cage, something stirred deep in her soul, the same protective instinct that made her fight for her twins every single day. Clay Big Bear Lawson was 6'9" of pure shame, trapped in a traveling cage where folks paid 2 bits to mock his fall from grace. When Mercy saw him flinch at the cruel laughter, she recognized the same pain her children faced at school every day. That night, she bet her last gold coin in a poker game to buy his freedom. She offered him her barn, honest work, and something he'd forgotten existed: human dignity. As Clay taught her twins to stand tall and Mercy sewed him a coat that finally fit, they discovered that broken people can build the strongest families. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1882 painted Redemption Gap in shades of amber and rust, a mining town perched like a weathered prayer between the Montana peaks. Smoke curled from 100 chimneys, carrying the scent of wood fires and the lingering promise of winter. The mountains stood sentinel around the valley, their snow-capped peaks catching the early morning light like scattered diamonds on velvet. Mercy Calder's needle moved with practiced precision through the navy wool, each stitch a small act of defiance against the world that had tried to break her. The worn silver thimble on her finger, her mother's thimble, and her grandmother's before, that caught the lamplight as she worked. 3 generations of women had worn this thimble, each one learning that strength came not from the absence of breaking, but from the grace found in mending. At 48, Mercy carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had loved deeply and lost honestly. Her auburn hair, now threaded with silver, was pulled back in a simple bun that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Her hands, though lined with the careful scars of a seamstress's trade, still moved with the fluid confidence of someone who understood that creating something beautiful from nothing was its own form of magic. The small cabin she shared with her 12-year-old twins, Emma and Samuel, sat at the edge of town where respectability faded into uncertainty. It was a modest home, built by her late husband Thomas with lumber that still smelled of pine sap on humid days. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as her sewing room, and a parlor that held their few precious belongings, a daguerreotype of Thomas in his Sunday clothes, a Bible with worn edges, and the rocking chair where she had nursed both babies through their first winters. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her dark hair falling like a curtain as she bent over her arithmetic. She possessed her father's steady concentration but her mother's expressive eyes that missed nothing and forgave much. Samuel, meanwhile, whittled by the fireplace, his knife moving carefully along a piece of oak. Where his sister was contemplative, Samuel burned with curiosity, always asking questions that had no easy answers. "Mama," Emma said, without looking up from her slate, "Mrs. Henderson says it's not proper for a widow to take in boarders." Mercy's needle paused for just a heartbeat. Mrs. Henderson has never had to choose between pride and her children's supper. The truth was sharper than any needle. Since Thomas died 2 years ago, in a mine collapse that took 17 good men, Mercy had survived on the thin margin between dignity and desperation. Her sewing brought in enough to keep them fed barely, but the land debt Thomas had taken to buy, their small plot, hung over them like a storm cloud that never quite broke. Samuel looked up from his whittling wood shavings scattered around his boots. "The Jameson boys called you names again today." "What kind of names?" Mercy's voice remained steady, but her thimble gleamed as her grip tightened. "Said you were strange for not remarrying. Said we were too poor to matter." Emma's voice carried the particular hurt that comes when cruelty finds its mark. "Billy Jameson said his pa told him we'd be run out of town before Christmas." Mercy set down her sewing and looked at her children, really looked at them. They were growing up too fast, shouldering burdens that belonged to adults. Emma's dresses were let down as far as they could go, and Samuel's trousers showed careful patches where the knees had worn through. But they were good children, kind children, and they deserved better than the whispers that followed them through town. "Listen to me, both of you," she said, moving to kneel beside their chairs. "What people say about us doesn't change who we are. We know our worth, and that's enough." "But what if they're right?" Samuel asked, his knife still in his small hands. "What if we don't belong here?" Before Mercy could answer, the sound of music drifted through the evening. Ira Calliope's cheerful melody that seemed to promise magic and wonder. The traveling carnival had arrived, setting up in the field beyond the church. Samuel's eyes lit up with the particular joy that belongs to 12-year-old boys and the promise of adventure. "Can we go, Mama, please? Just to look?" Mercy glanced at the small pile of coins on her kitchen shelf, the result of trading her latest quilt to Mrs. Patterson for winter beans. They could spare a few pennies, and perhaps the distraction would do them all good. "We'll go tomorrow evening, after I finish Mrs. Whitman's dress." But the carnival brought more than wonder to Redemption Gap. It brought Silas Drummond, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose pockets jangled with other people's misfortune. He was a collector of broken people, specifically, and he had arrived with his most prized possession. The cage sat in the center of the carnival like a terrible altar. Built from iron bars and mounted on wagon wheels, it was just large enough for a man to stand upright, though he could not lie down comfortably or extend his arms fully. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Big Bear Lawson, the gentle giant, see how the mighty fall." Inside the cage, Clay Lawson sat with his knees drawn up, his massive frame folded in on itself like a prayer no one wanted to hear. At 6'9", he had once commanded respect as a trail boss, leading cattle drives across the territories with the kind of quiet authority that men followed without question. His shoulders, broad enough to carry the weight of responsibility, now curved inward with shame. His hands, once steady enough to gentle a spooked horse or comfort a grieving cowboy, hung empty between his knees. 3 months. 3 months since the poker game in Billings that changed everything. 3 months since he discovered that the cards were marked, the debt manufactured, and his freedom sold to the highest bidder. 3 months of jeers and pointing fingers, of children throwing pebbles through the bars, while their parents watched, with the peculiar satisfaction that comes from seeing someone else's downfall. Clay's crime had not been gambling, it had been trusting. He had trusted the wrong men in the wrong game, and when the dust settled, he owed more money than most men saw in a lifetime. The debt was impossible, designed to be impossible, and when he couldn't pay, they offered him a choice, prison or the cage. At least in the cage, they told him, he could work off his debt. What they didn't tell him was that the debt grew faster than his earnings, keeping him trapped in a cycle designed to break his spirit along with his body. Dr. Marcus Hartwell, Redemption Gap's physician and one of its few genuine gentlemen, had tried to speak with Clay when the carnival first arrived. The doctor's kind eyes and soft-spoken manner reminded Clay of his own father, dead these 15 years. But shame is a powerful thing, and Clay had turned away from the offered kindness, unable to bear the pity he saw in the doctor's face. The townspeople came in waves to gawk at the fallen giant. Some brought genuine curiosity, others that particular cruelty that emerges when people need to feel superior to someone, anyone. They paid their 2 bits and listened to Silas Drummond's practiced spiel about the wages of sin and the fall of pride. "Look upon this man," Drummond would announce with the theatrical flair of a born showman, "and see what comes of thinking yourself above your station." Clay Lawson was once the boss of the trail, commanding respect and good wages, but pride goeth before the fall, and gambling is the devil's own game. What Drummond didn't tell his audiences was the truth that Clay had been deliberately targeted, his reputation and holdings making him a perfect mark for men who specialized in the sophisticated theft of lives. They had studied him, learned his habits, his honor, his fatal tendency to trust a man's word as bond. The poker game had been a trap as carefully laid as any snare, and Clay had walked into it with the trusting nature that had once made him beloved by the men he led. Morton Price, Redemption Gap's banker, had been among the first to visit the carnival. A thin man with calculating eyes and soft hands that had never known honest work, Price saw opportunity in other people's misfortune. He had looked at Clay in that cage and seen not a human being, but a cautionary tale he could use to pressure his own debtors. You see where defiance leads, he had told more than one struggling farmer or widow behind on payments. Pay what you owe, or end up like the giant. But Price's interest in Clay went deeper than mere intimidation. He had been asking questions, careful questions, about Clay's past and his holdings. The kind of questions that suggested Clay's misfortune might not be as random as it appeared. As the evening deepened and the carnival lights began to twinkle like earthbound stars, the people of Redemption Gap prepared for another night of entertainment at the expense of human dignity. They would bring their families, their children, to point and stare and feel grateful for their own circumstances. Tomorrow, Mercy Calder would walk into this scene with her twins beside her, carrying the worn silver thimble that had seen 3 generations of women through their trials. She would look into that cage and see not a fallen giant, but a broken soul who reminded her of her own children's pain. And everything would change. The wind picked up as darkness settled over the valley, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming to Redemption Gap, but it would not find them unchanged. Some stories begin with grand gestures and dramatic moments, but the most powerful transformations often start with something as simple as one person recognizing the humanity in another. In her cabin, Mercy finished the last stitches on Mrs. Whitman's dress and counted the coins that would buy her children a few hours of wonder at the carnival. She had no way of knowing that she was about to make a choice that would redefine not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she touched. The silver thimble caught the lamplight one last time as she set aside her sewing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices. Tonight, she would hold her children close and remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with simple human kindness. Outside, the calliope played its cheerful tune, masking the quiet desperation that lived in a cage at the carnival's heart. But music cannot drown out the truth forever, and truth has a way of finding those brave enough to face it. Mercy Calder was about to discover just how brave she could be. The carnival came alive as evening settled over Redemption Gap like a patchwork quilt of light and shadow. Paper lanterns swayed in the mountain breeze, casting dancing patterns across the faces of families who had come seeking a few hours of escape from their daily struggles. The smell of roasted peanuts and caramel apples mixed with the earthier scents of hay and horses, creating an atmosphere that promised magic but delivered something far more complex. Mercy walked between her twins, Emma's small hand tucked securely in her left, while Samuel bounded ahead with the irrepressible energy of boyhood. She had dressed them in their Sunday clothes, Emma in the blue dress, with careful repairs at the seams, Samuel in trousers that had belonged to his father and were still too long despite the boy's recent growth. Mercy herself wore her grey wool dress, the one that had seen her through church services and town meetings, respectable but unremarkable. "Look, Mama," Samuel pointed toward a man on stilts who towered above the crowd like a benevolent giant. "He's even taller than Papa was." Emma squeezed her mother's hand, a gesture that spoke of shared memory and loss. Thomas had been a tall man, 6'3" in his stocking feet, with hands large enough to encompass both his children's faces when he blessed them each night. The stilt walker's artificial height brought comfort rather than pain. It reminded them that being different wasn't always a curse. They moved through the carnival slowly, taking in each wonder with the careful appreciation of people who understood that such experiences were rare treasures. Samuel gasped at the Fire Eater's performance, while Emma watched the dancing horses with quiet delight. Mercy found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks, watching her children experience joy without the shadow of worry that too often darkened their young faces. But then they reached the center of the carnival, and the laughter died in Mercy's throat. The cage stood illuminated by 4 lanterns, creating a circle of harsh light that turned entertainment into spectacle and spectacle into cruelty. A small crowd had gathered, some laughing, others pointing, all of them treating the man inside as less than human. Clay Lawson sat with his back against the bars, his enormous frame compressed into a space designed to humiliate as much as contain. Two bits to hear the story of the fallen giant. Silas Drummond called out, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had turned suffering into profit. See how pride and gambling brought low the mightiest cowboy in Montana territory. Emma pressed closer to her mother's side, her young face troubled by something she couldn't quite name. Samuel, meanwhile, stared with the frank curiosity of childhood, trying to understand why a man would be kept in a cage like an animal. "Why is he in there, Mama?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying far enough that several nearby adults turned to look at them with expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval. Before Mercy could answer, a boy about Samuel's age threw a pebble through the bars. It struck Clay's shoulder, and the big man flinched not from pain, but from the recognition that his humanity had become a source of entertainment. In that flinch, Mercy saw something that cut through her heart like a blade. The same helpless hurt she witnessed when the Jameson boys called her children names at school. "He's there because some folks think it's entertaining to watch another person's misery," Mercy said, her voice carrying clearly enough that several audience members shifted uncomfortably. Silas Drummond's eyes fixed on her with the calculating look of a predator who had identified potential trouble. "Ma'am, this here's a lawful exhibition. The giant owes a debt, and this is how he's working it off. Ain't nothing improper about it." "There's nothing lawful about treating a human being like a circus animal," Mercy replied, her voice steady despite the tremor of anger running through her. "Come along, children." But as they turned to leave, Clay Lawson raised his head and looked directly at her. In his eyes, Mercy saw something that stopped her cold: gratitude. Not hope required, the possibility of change, but simple gratitude that someone, anyone, had seen him as human. Those eyes haunted her through the rest of their carnival visit. While Emma and Samuel enjoyed the puppet show and shared a bag of roasted nuts, Mercy found her thoughts returning again and again to the man in the cage. She had seen broken things before: animals caught in traps, people crushed by circumstances beyond their control. But there was something about Clay Lawson's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation that spoke to her in a language deeper than words. As the evening wound down and the crowds began to thin, Mercy made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She walked her children back to the cabin, tucked them into bed with stories and prayers, and then returned to the carnival alone. The night air carried a chill that spoke of winter's approach, and most of the families had gone home to warm fires and comfortable beds. Only the serious gamblers and dedicated drinkers remained, gathered now in the back room of Murphy's saloon, where Silas Drummond held court with a deck of cards and a smile that promised easy money. Mercy had never been in a saloon before. The smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke made her eyes water, and the rough laughter of men deep in their cups sent shivers down her spine. But she pushed through the fear and the impropriety because something larger than social convention was driving her forward. "Well, well," Drummond said, as she appeared in the doorway of the back room. "If it isn't the lady with opinions about my business, come to apologize for your rudeness?" "I've come to make a proposition," Mercy said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She reached into her reticule and withdrew her last gold eaglet coin she had been saving for the twins' winter boots. "I want to play for the giant's freedom." The room fell silent except for the tick of the saloon clock and the distant sound of the wind through the eaves. 5 men sat around the table, including Drummond and Morton Price, whose presence here struck Mercy as oddly significant. All of them stared at her with expressions ranging from amusement to disbelief. "Ma'am," said Pete Morrison, a local rancher, "this ain't a game for ladies. These boys play for serious money." "I'm serious about my money too," Mercy replied, setting the gold coin on the table where it caught the lamplight like a small sun. "One hand, if I win, You give me papers saying Clay Lawson's debt is paid and he's free to go. If you win, you keep my coin, and I'll never trouble you again." Drummond's eyes glittered with avarice and amusement. "Lady, that giant owes more than $500. Your little gold piece wouldn't cover a tenth of it." "Then you shouldn't have any trouble taking it from me," Mercy said with a calm she didn't feel. The men exchanged glances, and she could practically hear their thoughts. Easy money from a desperate widow who didn't understand the game she was trying to play. What they didn't know was that Thomas had taught her poker during the long winter evenings, using matchsticks for stakes and laughter for currency. She wasn't an expert, but she understood the basics of the game and the greater importance of reading the people who played it. "5-card draw," Drummond said finally, shuffling the deck with practiced ease. "Winner takes all." Mercy nodded and took the seat across from him, acutely aware that she was risking her children's security on a single hand of cards. But some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was living with the knowledge that she had walked away from someone who needed help. The cards whispered against each other as Drummond dealt, and Mercy found herself thinking not of the money she might lose, but of the look in Clay Lawson's eyes when he realized someone cared enough to try. Whatever happened next, she would not have to live with the regret of doing nothing. The game began with the sound of coins hitting the table and the soft rustle of cards being arranged. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the saloon windows like an impatient spirit, demanding entry. And in a cage at the carnival's heart, Clay Lawson sat in the darkness, unaware that his fate was being decided by a woman who had seen his humanity when others saw only entertainment. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on grand stages, but in smoky back rooms where courage meets desperation and ordinary people make extraordinary choices. Mercy Calder was about to discover what she was truly made of, one card at a time. The poker hand had lasted less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes changed everything. Mercy's pair of queens had beaten Drummond's bluff, and the look of shock on the man's face when she laid down her cards was worth more than the gold eagle she had risked. The hastily scrawled paper declaring Clay Lawson's debt paid in full might not hold up in a court of law, but it was enough to get him out of that cage. Now, 3 days later, Clay stood in Mercy's barn trying to make sense of his newfound freedom. The structure was modest but well built, with thick walls that kept out the mountain wind and a loft that provided storage for hay and privacy for a man who needed time to remember how to be human again. Thomas Calder had built this barn with careful hands and a generous heart, creating spaces for animals and tools and the thousand small necessities of rural life. Clay's few possessions: a worn saddle, a pair of boots that had walked countless miles, and the clothes on his back looked lost in the empty stall Mercy had cleared for him. She had provided blankets, a wash basin, and a small table that had belonged to her late husband. The kindness felt almost overwhelming after months of degradation. "The work's not complicated," Mercy said as she showed him around the property that first morning. "The fence line needs mending before winter, the well cover's coming loose, and there's firewood to split. Nothing you can't handle." Clay nodded, his voice still rusty from disuse. "I'm grateful for the chance, ma'am. I won't be any trouble." "My name is Mercy," she said firmly, "and everyone deserves a chance to start over." The twins had watched this exchange with the careful attention of children who understood that their world was shifting in ways they couldn't quite comprehend. Emma clutched her wooden dollar simple toy carved by her father's hands during the long evenings before his death. The doll's painted face had worn smooth over the years, but Emma treasured it as her last tangible connection to the man who had taught her that gentleness was not weakness. Samuel, meanwhile, studied Clay with the frank curiosity of boyhood. The giant's presence filled their small world in ways that went beyond his physical size. Here was someone even larger than Papa had been, someone who moved with careful deliberation, as if afraid his strength might accidentally cause harm. "Are you really a trail boss?" Samuel asked on the second day, finding Clay mending fence in the back pasture. Clay paused in his work, hammer suspended mid-swing. Was, he said quietly. Not anymore. But you know about cattle and horses and such. Some. Clay drove the nail home with a single precise blow. Your pa never taught you about ranch work? Samuel's face clouded. He was going to. Said he'd teach me when I got bigger. But then the mine took him. The simple statement carried the weight of dreams deferred and lessons unlearned. Clay set down his hammer and really looked at the boy for the first time. 12 years old, small for his age, but with intelligent eyes and willing hands. The same age Clay had been when his own father began teaching him the ways of cattle and horses. Well, Clay said carefully, if your ma doesn't mind, maybe I could show you a thing or two. Nothing fancy, just basic things every man should know. Samuel's face lit up like sunrise. Really? You'd do that? If it's all right with your mother. That evening, as Mercy served a simple supper of beans and cornbread in her kitchen, Samuel bubbled with excitement about his day. Clay's going to teach me about ranching, Mama. He says Papa would have wanted me to learn. Mercy glanced at Clay, who sat uncomfortably at their small table, as if unsure whether he belonged there. His massive frame made the chair look like child's furniture, but his manner was gentle, deferential. He ate with the careful politeness of a man who understood that this meal was a gift, not a right. That's kind of him, Mercy said, but remember, Clay has his own work to do. Don't be a bother. He's no bother, Clay said quietly. Boy should learn how to handle himself. World can be hard on those who don't know how to stand up when it matters. Emma, who had been silent through most of the meal, suddenly spoke up. The Jameson boys said you were a criminal. They said their pa told them you belonged in that cage. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of the fire. Clay's face darkened, but not with anger, with shame that these children had heard such things about him. Emma, Mercy said sharply, but Clay held up a hand. No, it's all right, he said. She deserves an honest answer. He looked directly at Emma, his weathered face serious. I made mistakes, little miss. Trusted the wrong people. Got taken advantage of. That doesn't make me a criminal, but it doesn't make me smart either. The Jameson boys call us names too, Emma said quietly. Say we're too poor to matter. Something shifted in Clay's expression, a hardening that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with protection. Is that so? They bother you kids at school? Clay's voice carried an edge that made both children sit up straighter. Samuel nodded reluctantly. Billy Jameson mostly. He's bigger than us, and his friends think he's funny. Clay was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he spoke. Tomorrow, after I finish the fence work, maybe I'll show you both a few things about standing up for yourselves. Not fighting, that should always be the last choice, but standing. What kind of standing? Emma asked, intrigued despite herself. The kind that makes bullies think twice about bothering you. Your pa was probably going to teach you the same things when you got older. Mercy watched this exchange with mixed emotions. Part of her was grateful that someone cared enough about her children to want to protect them. Another part worried about bringing more attention to their little family, which already attracted enough gossip from the more judgmental members of their community. Just remember, she said carefully, we don't want trouble. Sometimes trouble finds you whether you want it or not, Clay replied. Better to be ready for it. That night, after the children were asleep, Mercy sat in her rocking chair, mending one of Samuel's shirts by lamplight. Through the window, she could see the warm glow from the barn where Clay had made his simple home. She wondered what he was thinking in those quiet hours, whether he regretted accepting her help, whether he felt the weight of obligation as heavily as she felt the risk of having taken him in. The decision to help him had been impulsive, driven by emotion rather than logic. Now, in the practical light of day-to-day living, she was beginning to understand the full implications of what she had done. The town was already talking. She could see it in the careful way people greeted her at the general store, hear it in the sudden silences that fell when she entered a room. But watching Clay with her children, seeing the careful way he moved around them, the respectful distance he maintained, while still showing genuine interest in their welfare, it gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, She had made the right choice. In the barn, Clay lay on his simple bed staring up at the rafters Thomas Calder had cut and fitted with his own hands. The work was solid, honest, built to last. Like the man who had done it, if the stories Clay had heard were true. Like the family that man had left behind. Clay had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as human, to have someone trust him with meaningful work, to sit at a table where his presence was welcome rather than merely tolerated. The feeling was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Tomorrow, he would continue mending the fence, and maybe he would teach the children a few basic moves for defending themselves. Small steps toward building something that felt almost like belonging. For the first time in months, Clay Lawson fell asleep without the sound of jeering laughter echoing in his ears. The morning, Clay decided to wear his old trail boss hat again. Something fundamental shifted in the household. Emma noticed it first as she helped her mother prepare breakfast, watching through the kitchen window as Clay emerged from the barn with the weathered Stetson settled firmly on his head. The hat had spent months crushed in the bottom of his meager belongings, a reminder of shame and failure. But now it sat on his graying hair, with the natural authority of a man who had once commanded respect across 1,000 miles of open range. "He looks different," Emma observed, stirring the porridge with careful attention to keep it from burning. Mercy glanced up from slicing bread and followed her daughter's gaze. Clay was indeed different straighter somehow, as if the hat had reminded him of who he used to be. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a flower turn toward sunlight. "Sometimes," Mercy said thoughtfully, "we all need something to remind us of our better selves." Samuel burst through the kitchen door with the enthusiasm of a boy who had discovered treasure. "Clay's going to teach us about balance today. He says if you can't keep your feet under you, nothing else matters in a fight." "It's not about fighting," Emma corrected with the patient superiority of an older sister. "It's about not getting pushed around." The distinction mattered, and Clay had been careful to make it clear during their first lesson the previous afternoon. He had shown them how to stand with their feet shoulder-width apart, how to lower their center of gravity, how to absorb a push without falling backward. Simple things, but important ones for children who had learned too young that the world could be an unkind place. "Did it work?" Mercy asked, when Billy Jameson tried his usual nonsense. Samuel's grin was answer enough, but he provided details anyway. He shoved Emma like he always does, but she just bent her knees and stayed right where she was. You should have seen his face. He tried again, harder, but she didn't budge. Then he called her a name I can't repeat, and she just looked at him and said, "Is that the best you can do?" Emma flushed with pride and embarrassment. Clay said the best defense against bullies is not caring what they think. Hard to hurt someone who won't be hurt. Mercy felt a complicated mixture of pride and concern. She was glad her children were learning to defend themselves, but she also knew that change, even positive change often, came with unexpected consequences. The town of Redemption Gap was not always kind to those who refused to stay in their assigned places. After breakfast, as Clay returned to his work on the fence line, Mercy found herself studying him with new eyes. The hat wasn't the only changes. Posture was different, his movements more confident. The careful subservience of a broken man was gradually giving way to something that looked almost like his former self. She was so absorbed in her observations that she almost missed Dr. Hartwell's approach. The physician's buggy rattled up the lane with its familiar creak of well-worn wheels and the gentle clop of his aging mare's hooves. "Morning, Mercy," Dr. Hartwell called as he climbed down from his seat. At 65, Marcus Hartwell was one of the few people in Redemption Gap who treated everyone with equal dignity, regardless of their circumstances. His weathered face carried the lines of a man who had seen enough suffering to understand the value of kindness. "Doctor," Mercy replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you out this way?" "Wanted to check on your new hand," he said, nodding toward Clay. "Man spent months in conditions that would break a horse. Figured he might need medical attention." But as Dr. Hartwell approached Clay, it became clear that the examination was really an excuse for conversation. The two men talked quietly while the doctor made a show of checking Clay's general health, and Mercy caught fragments of their exchange on the mountain breeze. "Good to see you wearing that hat again, son. Felt right this morning, like maybe I remembered who I used to be. A man can lose many things and still be himself, just takes time to remember." Their conversation continued as Clay returned to his work, and Dr. Hartwell walked back toward Mercy with the satisfied expression of someone whose deeper purpose had been accomplished. "He'll do fine," the doctor said. "Good color, strong hands, clear eyes. Whatever devils he's been fighting, he's winning." "The town's not entirely pleased with my decision," Mercy admitted, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to confess her concerns to Dr. Hartwell. "The town's opinion changes with the weather," he replied gently. "What matters is whether you're pleased with your decision." That afternoon, Mercy made a choice that surprised even herself. She retrieved Thomas's old tool belt from the chest where she had stored his personal belongings, brushed off the dust, and carried it out to where Clay was working. The leather was well-oiled and supple, sized for a man of substantial build. It had hung unused for 2 years, waiting for hands that would never claim it. "These were my husband's," she said simply, holding out the belt. "Seems foolish to let good tools sit idle when there's work to be done." Clay stared at the offering for a long moment, understanding the weight of what she was giving him. These weren't just tools, they were a symbol of trust, of belonging, of the possibility that he might have a place in this small family's life. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I can't take another man's tools. Thomas would want them used." Mercy replied firmly. He believed tools were meant for building, not gathering dust. "Besides," she added with a slight smile, "they fit you better than they ever fit him." The truth was evident when Clay buckled the belt around his waist. Thomas had been a tall man, but Clay's frame was broader, more substantial. The tools hung naturally at his sides, as if they had been waiting for him all along. That evening brought another milestone, when Clay joined them for supper, without the careful hesitation that had marked his first days. He sat at the table like someone who belonged there, sharing stories of cattle drives and trail life that made the children laugh, and gave Mercy glimpses of the man he had been before. Circumstances brought him low. "Tell us about the time you stopped the stampede," Samuel begged, having heard hints of the story but never the full telling. Clay's eyes took on a distant look. "Well, we were 3 days out of Dodge City when a lightning storm spooked the herd. 2,000 head of cattle running scared in the dark, and if they'd hit that creek at full speed, we'd have lost half of them to drowning or broken bones." As he spoke, weaving the tale with the practiced skill of a natural storyteller, Mercy found herself watching the way his hands moved, the way his voice carried the authority of someone who had faced real danger and emerged victorious. This was not the broken man she had freed from a cage. This was Clay Lawson, trail boss, leader of men, someone who understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. When the children finally went to bed, full of stories and dreams of adventure, Mercy sat with Clay in the kitchen's comfortable silence. Outside, the wind carried the promise of winter, but inside, the warmth felt like more than just the heat from the stove. "The children are different," Mercy observed. "Happier, more confident." "They're good kids," Clay replied. "Just needed someone to remind them they're worth defending." "And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you need?" Clay was quiet for so long that Mercy wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. But finally, he spoke. "I need to remember that a man's worth isn't measured by his worst day," he said, "and maybe learn that some people are kind enough to help with the remembering." In the silence that followed, both of them understood that something important was being built between them, not just gratitude or obligation, but the foundation of something that might, given time, grow into something deeper and more lasting. The coat began as an act of practicality and grew into something approaching love. Mercy had noticed how Clay's shoulders strained against his worn jacket, how the sleeves ended inches above his wrists, how he hunched slightly to minimize his size in clothing that belonged to a smaller man. Winter was coming to the high country, and no one should face Montana cold in inadequate protection. She worked on it during the quiet evening hours after the children were asleep, her needle moving through the heavy wool by lamplight while the wind rattled the windows. The fabric was a deep brown, sturdy and warm, purchased with coins earned from her latest quilting commission. Each stitch was placed with careful attention, not just to durability, but to the way the garment would fit across Clay's broad back, the way it would hang from his shoulders without binding or pulling. The measuring had been an exercise in trust. Clay had stood patient and still in her kitchen while she worked around him with her tape measure, noting the span of his shoulders, the length of his arms, the circumference of his chest. He had endured the process with the quiet dignity that marked all his interactions with her family, but she had seen the way his hands trembled slightly when she reached around him to measure his back. "When did you last have something made specifically for you?" she had asked, immediately regretting the question when she saw the pain that flickered across his face. "My mother made me a shirt when I turned 16, he said quietly. Said a man needed at least one thing that fit proper. The memory had stayed with Mercy through every evening of sewing that followed. Somewhere, Clay Lawson had been a 16-year-old boy whose mother cared enough to ensure he was properly clothed. Somewhere between that boy and the broken man in the cage lay a story of dreams and disappointments that she was only beginning to understand. The children's transformation continued as autumn deepened toward winter. Samuel no longer came home with torn clothes or bruised knuckles from playground conflicts. Emma walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and had even joined the school's reading Sakala social group she had previously avoided due to the other children's whispered comments about her family's circumstances. "Miss Patterson says I read better than children 2 years older," Emma announced one evening as they gathered for supper. "She asked if I might help the younger ones with their letters." Clay looked up from his plate with genuine interest. "That's a fine thing, little miss. Teaching others is one of the best ways to learn." "Did you ever teach anyone?" Samuel asked. "Had to teach new cowboys the trailways," Clay replied. "Young men who thought they knew everything about cattle and horses until they met their first stampede or river crossing. Teaching patience was harder than teaching skills." These dinner conversations had become the highlight of Mercy's days. Clay's presence transformed their simple meals into something richer, fuller. His stories brought adventure to their quiet life, while his questions about the children's days showed a genuine interest that their own father, bless his memory, had sometimes been too tired to provide after long days in the mines. But not everyone in Redemption Gap shared the family's satisfaction with the arrangement. Morton Price had made several pointed visits to the general store when Mercy was shopping, commenting loudly about the impropriety of a widow taking in strange men. His words carried the weight of someone who held significant influence in the community, and Mercy noticed how other customers grew uncomfortable when he spoke. "Just saying," Price had announced during one such encounter, "that decent women don't harbor gamblers and debtors sets a poor example for the children." Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's wife, had nodded in vigorous agreement. "Mark my words, that man will bring trouble to this town. Men like that always do." Mercy had bitten her tongue and continued her shopping, but the words stung because they carried an echo of her own fears. What did she really know about Clay Lawson beyond what he chose to tell her? What if the stories about gambling debts were only the beginning of his troubles? These doubts multiplied when the telegram arrived. Samuel brought it from town, his young face serious with the importance of his errand. Telegrams were rare in their household, expensive communications, reserved for emergencies or significant business. The folded yellow paper felt ominous in Mercy's hands as she opened it with careful fingers. "Seeking information. Clay Lawson, stop. Last seen Billings, stop. Reward for whereabouts, stop. Urgent business, stop." The message was unsigned, but its implications were clear enough to send ice through Mercy's veins. Someone was looking for Clay, someone willing to pay for information about his location. The careful vagueness of urgent business suggested nothing good. She found Clay in the barn, oiling Thomas's tools with the methodical care of a man who understood that good equipment properly maintained could last a lifetime. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have warned him because his hands stilled on the leather he was treating. "Trouble?" he asked simply. She handed him the telegram and watched his face as he read. The careful composure he had rebuilt over the past weeks cracked slightly, revealing the fear that still lived beneath his growing confidence. "I should go," he said without looking up from the yellow paper. "Should you?" Mercy asked, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Or do you want to go?" Clay set down the telegram and the leather strap, turning to face her fully. "There's a difference between want and should, ma'am. I've brought enough trouble to good people." "What kind of trouble are we talking about? Who's looking for you?" For a long moment, Clay was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets too long held. "The men who owned my debt weren't just gamblers. They were part of something bigger, something that uses men like me to send messages to others who might think of resisting. I got away from them, thanks to you, but they don't like loose ends." "What kind of messages?" "The kind that keeps other debtors paying, other property owners signing over their land when the pressure gets too strong. I was their example of what happens to those who think they're too good for the life they're offered." Mercy felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, Morton Price's unusually detailed knowledge of Clay's situation, the banker's increased pressure on her own land debt, the careful way certain men in town watched Clay when they thought no one was looking. "You think Morton Price is involved?" "I think Morton Price knows more about my situation than a small-town banker should," Clay replied carefully. "And I think my being here puts you and the children at risk." That evening, as Mercy continued work on Clay's coat, she found herself stitching with unusual intensity. Each thread pulled tight was an act of defiance against the forces trying to tear apart the fragile happiness they had built. The coat was nearly finished now, requiring only the final fitting and the attachment of buttons she had carved from bone-simple, practical closures that would withstand hard use. She had started this project as an act of kindness, but somewhere in the weeks of careful stitching, it had become something more. The coat represented her growing feelings for the man who had brought purpose back to her daily routine, who had given her children confidence and laughter, who had reminded her that loneliness was not the inevitable state of widowhood. When Clay tried to speak of leaving again over their evening meal, Emma spoke up with the clear logic of childhood. "If you go, the bad people win. Papa used to say that running away from problems just makes them someone else's problems." Samuel nodded in agreement. "Besides, you promised to teach me how to read horse signs. Can't do that if you're gone." Clay looked helplessly at Mercy, seeking guidance from the woman who had risked everything to give him freedom. In her eyes, he saw not fear but determination, the same quality that had driven her to bet her last coin on a stranger's worth. "Maybe," Mercy said quietly, "it's time to stop running and start fighting back." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the mountain peaks with white and reminding everyone that winter waited for no one. Inside the small cabin, a family prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring, bound together by something stronger than blood or law, the choice to stand for each other when standing mattered most. Samuel's slingshot was a work of art, disguised as a boy's weapon. He had carved it from a fork of mountain ash, spending careful hours with his knife to shape the Y into something that fit perfectly in his small hands. The leather pouch was cut from a scrap of his father's old work gloves, and the bands were strips of rubber he had traded for with Jimmy Morrison, whose father had connections to the railroad supplies. "It's for protecting the family," Samuel announced as he showed his creation to Clay in the barn. "Like you taught us, sometimes a man has to stand up when it matters." Clay examined the slingshot with the serious attention he gave to all the children's efforts. The workmanship was impressive for a 12-year-old, showing patience and skill that spoke well of the boy's character. But more than that, it represented something Clay recognized from his own youth, the need to feel capable of protecting those you loved. "Your pa teach you woodworking?" Clay asked, running his thumb along the smooth handle. "Some. He was going to teach me more when I got older." Samuel's voice carried the familiar shadow that crossed his face whenever his father's interrupted plans came up in conversation. "Well, he did good work with what time he had," Clay said, handing back the slingshot. "But remember what we talked about. Only use it if there's no other choice," Samuel recited dutifully, "and never aim at anything you don't mean to hit." "That's right. Most times, just having it will be enough. Bullies usually back down when they realize you're not helpless." The conversation was interrupted by Mercy's call from the cabin. "Clay, could you come in for a moment?" Her voice carried an unusual formality that made both males exchange glances. They found her standing in the kitchen with the brown coat spread across the table, its final form revealed for the first time. The garment was magnificent, sturdy but elegant, cut to accommodate Clay's massive frame, without looking cumbersome or awkward. "Try it on," she said simply, but her hands trembled slightly as she held it out to him. Clay approached the coat like a man approaching an altar. He could see the hours of work stitched into every seam, the careful attention to details that would make the difference between mere clothing and a garment worthy of respect. When he slipped his arms into the sleeves, the fit was perfect, snug enough to show the breadth of his shoulders, loose enough to allow free movement. Emma watched from the doorway as Clay turned slowly, testing the range of motion. "It makes you look like a trail boss again," she said with the honest observation of childhood. She was right. The coat transformed Clay's appearance in ways that went beyond mere clothing. It restored a dignity that months in the cage had stripped away, reminding him and anyone who saw him that he was a man worthy of respect and careful attention. "Ma'am," Clay said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to thank me," Mercy replied, but her cheeks flushed with pleasure at his obvious delight. A man should have at least one thing that fits him properly. The echo of his mother's long-ago words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Clay's composure threatened to crack entirely. He stood in Mercy's kitchen wearing a coat made by her hands, surrounded by her children who looked at him with trust and affection, and felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of belonging somewhere. That afternoon brought a conversation that changed everything. As Clay worked on replacing the well cover and Mercy hung laundry in the crisp autumn air, the children played in the yard with Samuel's new slingshot. Their laughter carried on the mountain breeze, a sound of pure happiness that made both adults pause in their work to listen. "I've been thinking," Mercy said, approaching Clay with the careful manner of someone who had rehearsed her words. "About us, about what we're becoming." Clay set down his tools and gave her his full attention. Over the weeks, he had watched her carefully, noting the way she smiled more readily now, how her shoulders had lost some of their defensive tension, how she moved through her daily routines with the contentment of someone who was no longer carrying her burdens alone. "The children see you as their father," she continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "Not to replace Thomas, no one could do that, but as someone who cares for them, protects them, teaches them things they need to know. They're good children," Clay said carefully, "easy to care about." "And I," Mercy paused, gathering courage for words that would change their relationship forever. "I find myself thinking of you as more than just someone who helps with the work, more than just someone who's grateful for shelter." The silence that followed was filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. Clay had been aware of his growing feelings for Mercy. How could he not be? But he had kept them carefully hidden, believing he had no right to want more than the kindness she had already shown him. "Mercy," he said quietly, "I'm not the same man I was before. Don't know if I ever will be again. You deserve better than someone who comes with the kind of troubles I carry. Maybe I deserve someone who understands that life can break you down and that getting back up takes courage," she replied. "Maybe I deserve someone who sees my children as worth protecting and treats me as worth respecting." Before Clay could respond, Samuel came running around the corner of the cabin, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. "Ma, there's 3 men coming up the road, and they're asking Mrs. Patterson about Clay." The moment of tender possibility shattered like glass against stone. Clay's face hardened with recognition and determination as he straightened to his full height. "Get the children inside," he said to Mercy. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me or Dr. Hartwell." "Clay, please." His voice carried an authority that reminded her why men had once followed him across dangerous territory. "This is what I was afraid of, what I should have left to protect you from." But as Clay started toward the road, Emma's voice stopped him cold. "You promised you wouldn't run away from problems. You promised we'd face things together." Clay turned to see both children standing behind their mother, Samuel with his slingshot in his hands, and Emma clutching her wooden doll like a talisman. Their faces showed fear but also determination, the same quality their mother had displayed in that smoky back room when she risked everything for a stranger's freedom. "This isn't your fight," Clay said gently. "You're our family now," Emma replied, with the simple logic of a child who had seen enough of life to understand what mattered. "That makes it our fight, too." As the three strangers crested the hill and came into view, Clay felt something shift inside him. For months, he had been running from his past, accepting the role of victim that circumstances had forced upon him. But standing in the yard of the home Mercy had shared with him, wearing the coat she had made with her own hands, surrounded by children who called him family, he remembered what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. The men approaching were the kind who used fear and intimidation as tools of their trade. They rode expensive horses and wore guns with the casual familiarity of those who viewed violence as a business expense. Clay recognized the type, even if he didn't recognize the specific faces. "Stay behind me," he told his family, the words carrying the weight of a promise and a threat. "And remember, sometimes standing up is the only choice that leaves you able to look at yourself in the mirror." As the riders drew closer, Clay Lawson squared his shoulders and prepared to face the demons he had been running from. This time, he wouldn't be running alone. The three riders approached with the deliberate pace of men who knew their arrival would cause fear and wanted to savor every moment of it. The leader was a lean man with cold eyes and a carefully groomed mustache, wearing a coat that cost more than most people in Redemption Gap earned in a year. His companions flanked him like hunting hounds, their hands resting casually near their weapons, with the practiced ease of men who had used them before. Clay stood in the yard, wearing Mercy's coat, his family arrayed behind him, and felt the familiar weight of danger settling over the scene like a shroud. But something was different this time. Instead of the helpless resignation that had carried him into that cage months ago, he felt the steady burn of righteous anger. "Clay Lawson," the leader called out as they reined in their horses 20 feet away. "Been looking for you, boy. Name's Garrett Webb, and I represent certain business interests that have an investment in your well-being." "My debt was paid," Clay replied, his voice carrying the authority he had once used to command trail crews. "I have papers to prove it." Webb's laugh was like the sound of ice cracking. "Papers from a traveling carnival man? Son, I'm afraid your legal education is somewhat lacking. That debt was purchased by my employers from Mr. Drummond, along with all associated rights and obligations." Dr. Hartwell's buggy appeared on the road behind the riders, the elderly physician's arrival perfectly timed, as if he had been watching from a distance. His presence lent an air of respectability to the confrontation, and Webb's expression suggested he recognized the inconvenience of witnesses. "Gentlemen," Dr. Hartwell called out as he climbed down from his buggy, "might I ask what brings you to Mrs. Calder's property?" "Legal business, old man," Webb replied with dismissive courtesy, "collecting on a debt." But Dr. Hartwell moved forward with the confidence of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when something smelled rotten. From his medical bag, he withdrew a folded document that he handed to Clay with deliberate ceremony. "I took the liberty of investigating your situation, son," the doctor said. "Seems there are some irregularities in the paperwork surrounding your alleged debt." Clay unfolded the document and felt the world shift beneath his feet. It was a copy of the original poker game records from Billings, complete with witness statements and an official investigation report. The cards had indeed been marked, the game rigged, and the debt manufactured through deliberate fraud. More shocking still, the investigation had uncovered connections between the gambling operation and a larger conspiracy involving land speculation and intimidation. "This says the debt was fraudulent," Clay said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Says I was deliberately targeted because of my property holdings in the Judith Basin." Webb's composure cracked slightly. "That document has no legal standing. My employers—" "Your employers," Dr. Hartwell interrupted with the gentle authority of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, "appear to be part of a criminal conspiracy to defraud honest citizens of their property. The territorial marshal has been most interested in the pattern of similar cases across Montana." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Sheriff Morrison, whose timing suggested this confrontation had been anticipated. Behind him rode two deputized men, their badges glinting in the afternoon sunlight. Morrison was an honest lawman who had been suspicious of Webb's group since their arrival in town that morning. "Problem here, folks?" Morrison asked, though his hand rested on his gun butt in a way that suggested he had already formed opinions about the nature of any problems. Webb's eyes darted between the sheriff, the doctor, and the document in Clay's hands. His companions shifted nervously in their saddles, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond their ability to control through intimidation. "Sheriff," Webb said with forced calm, "we're simply here to collect on a legitimate debt. This man owes substantial money to our business associates." "Funny thing about that debt," Morrison replied, accepting the document Dr. Hartwell offered and scanning its contents. "Seems the territorial marshal's office has been tracking a pattern of similar fraudulent gambling operations. Got a wire this morning saying they'd appreciate having a conversation with anyone connected to those activities." The revelation hit Clay like a physical blow. For months, he had carried the shame of his supposed failure, the guilt of falling victim to gambling addiction, the humiliation of being displayed as an example of moral weakness. Now, in the span of minutes, he was learning that his fall had been orchestrated, his property targeted, his freedom stolen through deliberate criminal conspiracy. "You mean I never really owed anything?" Clay asked, his voice hollow with shock. "Son," Dr. Hartwell said gently, "you were the victim of a sophisticated confidence scheme designed to steal your landholdings in the Judith Basin. The gambling debt was just the mechanism they used to break you down and make you compliant." Behind Clay, Mercy gasped as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The land in the Judith Basin, that's valuable grazing territory, worth far more than any gambling debt. Worth enough to make it profitable to spend months breaking a man's spirit, Dr. Hartwell confirmed. Worth enough to involve corrupt officials in multiple territories. Webb's face had gone pale as he realized how thoroughly his operation had been exposed. His companions looked ready to bolt, their confidence in their employer's protection evaporating like morning mist. "And Morton Price?" Clay asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mr. Price has been surprisingly helpful in identifying local properties that might become available for the right kind of pressure," Sheriff Morrison said grimly. "Amazing how many widows and struggling farmers have found themselves in debt to his bank right around the time these gentlemen show interest in their land." Emma stepped forward from behind her mother, clutching her wooden doll and speaking with the clear voice of childhood innocence. "So the bad men made up lies about Clay to steal his land?" "That's exactly right, little miss," Dr. Hartwell said. "And when honest folks like your mother stood up for him, it probably scared them because it meant their plan wasn't working the way they wanted." Samuel raised his slingshot with the serious expression of a boy who finally understood the nature of the enemy they faced. "So, we were right to fight back?" "You were right to stand together," Sheriff Morrison confirmed. "Sometimes that's the only way to face down people who profit from other folks' misery." Webb made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "Sheriff, I think you'll find that my employers have considerable influence with territorial authorities. It would be unfortunate if—" "If what?" Morrison interrupted. "If honest law enforcement interfered with a criminal conspiracy? Mr. Webb, I think you'll find that the territorial marshal has very specific opinions about influence peddling and corruption." The sheriff's deputies moved their horses to flank Webb's group, making it clear that departure was no longer a matter of choice. Webb's face cycled through anger, fear, and resignation as he realized that months of careful planning had unraveled in a single afternoon. "This isn't over," Webb said, though the words lacked conviction. "Oh, I think it is," Clay replied, and for the first time in months, his voice carried the full authority of a man who knew his own worth. "Sheriff, I'd like to press charges against these men and anyone else involved in this conspiracy. I want my property restored, my name cleared, and justice for every family they've hurt." As Webb and his companions were escorted away by the sheriff's men, Clay stood in the yard, wearing Mercy's coat, and felt something he had thought lost forever: the complete vindication of his character and the restoration of his rightful place in the world. But more than that, he felt the strength that came from being surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with him when standing mattered most. Mercy had risked everything to give him freedom. Her children had accepted him as family. Dr. Hartwell had worked behind the scenes to uncover the truth. Sheriff Morrison had chosen justice over convenience. "So what happens now?" Mercy asked, moving to stand beside him as the dust settled from the departing horses. Clay looked down at the woman who had seen his worth when he couldn't see it himself, at the children who had called him family when he felt like nothing more than a broken man seeking shelter. The answer came to him with perfect clarity. "Now we build something together," he said, "something honest and good and strong enough to last." The forged debt papers that had held him captive were nothing more than lies on worthless paper. But the bonds that connected him to this family, those were real, chosen, and unbreakable. The days following Webb's arrest moved with the strange intensity of a gathering storm. Clay found himself at the center of a legal whirlwind that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Redemption Gap, as territorial marshals and federal investigators descended on the small mining town to unravel a conspiracy that had touched dozens of families across 3 territories. Dr. Hartwell's parlor had been transformed into an impromptu headquarters where Clay met with lawyers and lawmen, his testimony crucial to building cases against not just Webb and his associates, but the larger network of corrupt officials and fraudulent businessmen who had profited from broken lives and stolen dreams. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had been displayed in a cage as an example of failure was now the key witness in exposing a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. "Your case is the clearest example we have," explained Marshal Thomas Brennan, a weathered man whose badge carried the authority of the federal government. "The documentation Dr. Hartwell uncovered, combined with your first-hand knowledge of their methods, gives us the foundation we need to bring down the entire operation." Clay nodded, but his attention kept drifting to the window, where he could see Mercy's cabin. The legal machinery grinding toward justice was important, but it felt secondary to the more pressing question of what came next for the family he had grown to love. Mercy herself seemed to understand this tension. She had attended several of the meetings. Her presence, both supportive and practical, someone needed to take notes and ask the questions that Clay, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his vindication, sometimes forgot to voice. Her steady competence in the face of complex legal proceedings reminded everyone present that she was far more than just a sympathetic widow who had shown kindness to a stranger. "The land in the Judith Basin," she said during one particularly dense discussion of property rights and territorial law. "What's the current status? Is Clay's original claim still valid?" The lawyer representing Clay's interests, a sharp-eyed man named Patterson, who had traveled from Helena specifically for this case, consulted his notes. "Not only valid, but considerably more valuable than when Mr. Lawson first filed his claim. The railroad surveys have confirmed what local ranchers suspected, that valley represents some of the finest grazing land in Montana Territory." Clay felt a familiar dizziness at the magnitude of what had been stolen from him and what was now being restored. The property he had worked years to acquire, the future he had planned before everything went wrong, the financial security that would have allowed him to marry and raise a family, all of it had been within his grasp before the conspiracy destroyed his life. "How much are we talking about?" Mercy asked, with the practical directness of a woman who had learned to think carefully about money. "Conservative estimate," Patterson replied. $15,000, possibly more depending on railroad development and cattle market conditions. The silence that followed was profound. $15,000 represented wealth beyond anything anyone in Redemption Gap had imagined, enough to transform not just Clay's life, but the entire future of the family he had grown to love. That evening, as Clay sat with Mercy and the children around their simple kitchen table, the weight of possibility hung heavy in the air. The same space that had witnessed his gradual healing now hosted conversations about a future that seemed almost too vast to comprehend. "So you'll be rich," Samuel said with the straightforward logic of childhood. "Rich enough to buy anything you want. Rich enough to go anywhere I choose." Clay agreed, though his eyes remained fixed on Mercy's face as he spoke. "Will you go back to the Judith Basin?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that adult decisions often involved leaving. Clay was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the question, but the assumptions behind it. The restored property represented everything he had thought he wanted: independence, financial security, the respect that came with substantial holdings. But sitting in this modest kitchen, surrounded by the people who had seen his worth when he couldn't see it himself, the appeal of distant wealth seemed somehow diminished. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally, "about what it means to have choices again, and what those choices say about who I want to be." Mercy's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. "And what do you want to be?" "I want to be someone who deserves the kindness you've shown me," Clay replied. "Someone who's worthy of the trust your children have placed in me. Someone who builds something lasting instead of just accumulating things." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Clay answered to find Sheriff Morrison standing in the gathering dusk, his expression grave enough to send immediate alarm through the household. "Sorry to disturb your evening," Morrison said, "but we have a problem. Morton Price has disappeared from his cell." The news hit like cold water. Price had been arrested 2 days earlier when the investigation revealed the full extent of his cooperation with the land fraud conspiracy. His bank records showed a pattern of suspicious foreclosures and property transfers that painted a clear picture of coordinated criminal activity. "How?" Clay asked, though he suspected the answer would not be reassuring. "Someone with authority and keys," Morrison replied grimly. "The night deputy was found unconscious, no sign of struggle, which suggests he knew his attacker. Price is gone, along with several files from his office that might have contained evidence against other conspirators." Dr. Hartwell appeared behind the sheriff, his weathered face creased with concern. "I've been making rounds, checking on families that might be at risk. Price knows which witnesses are most dangerous to his associates." The implication was clear. Price's escape wasn't just about avoiding justice for his own crimes, but about eliminating the people whose testimony could bring down the larger conspiracy. Clay felt a familiar chill as he realized that his family's safety, which had seemed assured by Webb's arrest, was now very much in question. "What do you recommend?" Mercy asked, moving to stand beside Clay with the calm determination that had first attracted his respect. "I've got men watching the main roads out of town," Morrison said, "but Price knows this country better than most, could be hiding anywhere in the mountains, or he could have help getting to places where territorial law doesn't reach. More than that," Dr. Hartwell added, "he's desperate. Men like Price don't handle public disgrace well, especially when it means losing everything they've spent years accumulating. Desperate men make dangerous choices." As the sheriff and doctor left to continue their rounds, Clay found himself facing a decision that felt familiar yet completely different from the choices that had brought him to this point. Months ago, he had been a victim fleeing from forces beyond his control. Now, he was a man with resources and allies, but also with people he loved who could be hurt by his enemies. "We should leave," he said to Mercy as they watched the lawman disappear into the darkness. "Take the children somewhere safe until this is resolved." Where? Mercy asked. And for how long? Price isn't the only corrupt official in this territory, and running away doesn't solve the larger problem. Emma, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with the serious expression she wore when grappling with adult problems. If we run away, then the bad people win. That's what you taught us. Samuel nodded vigorously, his hand moving automatically to the slingshot tucked in his belt. Besides, this is our home. We shouldn't have to leave because of people who lie and steal. Clay looked at the three faces turned toward him, the woman who had risked everything for his freedom, the children who had accepted him as family when he felt like nothing more than damaged goods. They were asking him to be the man he had once been, the leader who made hard decisions and stood by them regardless of cost. "All right," he said finally, "we stay. But we stay smart, and we stay together. No one goes anywhere alone. We keep the curtains drawn after dark. And at the first sign of real trouble, we get to Dr. Hartwell's house, where there are guns and men who know how to use them." As if summoned by his words, another knock sounded at the door. This time, it was Pete Morrison, the rancher whose poker skills had helped win Clay's freedom, accompanied by three other men from town. All of them carried rifles and wore expressions of grim determination. "Heard about Price?" Morrison said without preamble. "Figured you might appreciate some company tonight. Doc Hartwell's organizing watches for all the families who testified against the conspiracy." Behind Morrison stood Jim Patterson from the general store, Frank Mueller, the blacksmith, and young Tom Bradley, who worked at the livery stable. Not the most imposing group of men individually, but together they represented something that Price and his associates had never expected to face a community that had decided to stand up for its own. "Appreciate it," Clay said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Though I have to warn you, this could get dangerous." "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Mueller replied with the philosophical certainty of a man who worked with fire and metal. "Question is whether you're fighting for something that matters." As the men settled in around the cabin's perimeter and Mercy prepared coffee for the impromptu guards, Clay felt something he hadn't experienced since his trail boss days, the confidence that came from being part of a group united by common purpose and mutual trust. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges Price and his remaining allies could muster. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with him, Clay Lawson felt ready for whatever came next. The man who had once been broken by conspiracy and cruelty was now part of something larger and stronger, a community that understood the difference between justice and convenience and was willing to fight for the former even when the latter would be easier. The photograph idea came to Mercy as she watched the men prepare for their night-long vigil. In the morning, regardless of what the night brought, she would ask Clay to take the family to Mr. Henderson's photography studio. Whatever happened next, she wanted a record of this moment when four people who had chosen to become a family decided to face the future together, united by love and sustained by courage. Dawn broke grey and cold over Redemption Gap, painting the mountain peaks in shades of pewter and promise. The night had passed without incident, but the tension that gripped the town was palpable as families emerged from their homes to face another day of uncertainty. Clay had slept little, spending most of the dark hours listening to the soft conversations of the men who had volunteered to stand guard and thinking about the confrontation he knew was coming. The call came just after breakfast, delivered by young Tom Bradley, who had ridden hard from town with news that would change everything. "They found Price," he announced, sliding from his horse with the urgency of someone carrying vital information. "He's holed up in the old Jameson mine shaft with 3 other men. Says he wants to talk terms." Clay felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before dangerous moments, but this time it was tempered by something he hadn't possessed. During his trail boss days, the absolute certainty that he was fighting for people who mattered more than his own safety. "What kind of terms?" Clay asked, though he suspected Price's idea of negotiation would involve threats rather than genuine compromise. "Says he'll turn himself in peaceful, like if you meet him alone to discuss certain financial arrangements," Tom replied, Sheriff Morrison says it's obviously a trap, but Price is demanding you specifically. Won't talk to anyone else. Mercy stepped forward with a determined expression Clay had learned to recognize as a prelude to difficult conversations. You're not going alone. He won't talk if I bring others, Clay replied, though he appreciated her immediate concern for his safety. And we need to end this before someone gets hurt. Someone will get hurt if you walk into an obvious ambush, she countered, with the practical logic that had sustained her through 2 years of widowhood. There has to be another way. Dr. Hartwell arrived as they were debating strategy, his medical bag in one hand and a folded document in the other. His presence brought a sense of measured authority to the gathering tension. I've been corresponding with the territorial marshal, he announced, unfolding the paper. They've discovered something interesting about Mr. Price's financial arrangements. It seems he's been embezzling from his own bank to fund his participation in the land fraud conspiracy. Clay accepted the document and scanned its contents, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle click into place. Price hadn't just been cooperating with the criminals, she had been funding their operations with money stolen from his depositors, including many of the same families he was helping to defraud. This means he's facing federal banking charges in addition to the conspiracy counts. Dr. Hartwell explained, the kind of charges that carry serious prison time, regardless of any deals he might try to negotiate. So why does he want to meet? Emma asked, displaying the direct reasoning that often cut through adult complications. Because desperate men do desperate things, Clay replied, understanding now that Price's request for a meeting wasn't about negotiation, it was about elimination. The banker knew that Clay's testimony would send him to federal prison for the rest of his life, and a dead witness couldn't testify. Sheriff Morrison rode up as they were processing this realization, his face grim with the weight of difficult decisions. Behind him rode 2 of his deputies and Marshal Brennan, whose presence indicated that the federal government was taking a direct interest in the situation. We've got the mine surrounded, Morrison announced. But Price has chosen his position well. Only one way in or out, and he's got clear sightlines to anyone approaching. Could turn into a siege if we're not careful. Marshal Brennan dismounted and approached Clay with the measured courtesy of a man accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. Mr. Lawson, I understand Price has requested a meeting with you specifically. While I can't order you to comply, your cooperation could help us resolve this situation without bloodshed. What are you thinking? Clay asked, recognizing the look of someone who had developed a plan. Price doesn't know that we've discovered his banking crimes, Brennan explained. As far as he's concerned, the conspiracy charges are his biggest problem. If you go in there with this document, he indicated the paper Dr. Hartwell had brought, and make it clear that we know about the embezzlement, he might realize that fighting is pointless. Mercy stepped closer to Clay, her hand finding his arm with the natural intimacy that had developed between them over the weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations. And if he doesn't realize that? If he's past the point of rational thought, then we'll be ready, Morrison said grimly. Won't let you go in there without backup, even if it's not visible backup. Clay looked down at the woman whose courage had given him back his life, at the children who had accepted him as family when he felt like nothing more than broken goods. The property deed in his pocket represented financial security and independence, but the people surrounding him represented something far more valuable, the chance to be part of something larger than himself. I'll go, he said finally, but not to negotiate, to end this once and for all. As the men prepared for what might become the final confrontation with the conspiracy that had stolen so much from so many families, Clay felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This time, however, it felt different from the burden he had carried as a trail boss, leading men across dangerous territory. This time, he was fighting not just for survival or profit, but for the right of ordinary people to live without fear of those who would steal their dreams for personal gain. The original property deed crinkled in his pocket as he prepared to face Morton Price, one final time as a victim seeking mercy, but as a man defending everything he had learned to value. The confrontation with Morton Price unfolded in the shadowed entrance of the abandoned mine shaft, where years of extracting silver had left a hollow in the mountain that seemed to swallow sound and light. Clay approached with deliberate steps, his hands visible and empty, while hidden among the rocks and scrub pine. Sheriff Morrison's men waited with rifles trained on the mine entrance. Price emerged from the darkness like a spectre of his former authority, his once immaculate banker's attire now rumpled and stained with 3 days of desperate flight. The soft hands that had signed foreclosure papers now gripped a pistol with the shaking uncertainty of a man who had never expected to need violence to solve his problems. "Close enough, Lawson," Price called out when Clay reached the agreed upon distance. "You came alone, just like I asked. Shows you've got some sense left." "I came to end this," Clay replied, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect across cattle country. "You're finished, Price. The federal marshals know about the embezzlement, the conspiracy, all of it. There's nowhere left to run." Price's laugh was bitter and hollow. "You think I don't know that? Think I haven't figured out that I'm looking at the rest of my life in a federal prison? That's exactly why we need to come to an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where you don't testify about things that might be hard to prove without your cooperation," Price said, his gun hand steadying as desperation gave way to cold calculation. "The kind where you take your newfound wealth and disappear, maybe head back to that property in the Judith Basin and forget you ever heard of Redemption Gap." Clay felt the familiar weight of choice settling on his shoulders. Months ago, beaten down by circumstances and broken by humiliation, he might have considered such an offer. The restored property represented security and independence. Everything he had thought he wanted before his world collapsed in that rigged poker game. But now, standing in the mountain air with Mercy's courage sustaining him and her children's trust driving him forward, the decision was surprisingly easy. "No," Clay said simply. "I won't run, and I won't let you hurt any more families." Price's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You stupid fool. Do you think that seamstress and her brats are worth dying for, worth throwing away a fortune?" "Yes," Clay replied without hesitation. "They're worth everything." The gunshot rang out across the valley like thunder, but it came not from Price's shaking hand, but from Samuel's slingshot. The boy had worked his way through the rocks with the patience his father had taught him for hunting, and his stone struck Price's gun hand with enough force to send the weapon spinning into the darkness of the mine shaft. Price stumbled backward, clutching his injured hand and staring in shock at the 12-year-old boy who had emerged from concealment with the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally found a way to protect his family. "Told you I made it for protecting the family," Samuel said, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what he had just done. Before Price could recover, Sheriff Morrison and his deputies closed in from their hidden positions, surrounding the banker with drawn weapons and grim expressions. The conspiracy that had stolen dreams and broken lives across 3 territories was finally ending in the shadows of an abandoned mine, brought down not by federal marshals or territorial law, but by a boy with a slingshot and the courage to use it when it mattered most. As Price was led away in shackles, ranting about injustice and conspiracy, Clay felt something shift deep in his chest. The vindication was complete, now not just legally, but personally. The man who had been displayed in a cage as an example of failure had become the key to exposing a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. But more than that, he had found something he hadn't even known. He was looking for a family worth fighting for, a place where his presence made a difference, a future built on love rather than mere survival. Marshal Brennan approached as the last of Price's associates were taken into custody. "Mr. Lawson, I want you to know that your courage in seeing this through has saved dozens of families from losing their homes and livelihoods. The territorial government will be reviewing every suspicious foreclosure and property transfer connected to this conspiracy." Clay nodded his acknowledgement, but his attention was focused on the small group approaching from the direction of town. Mercy walked between her children, her face radiant with relief and pride, while Dr. Hartwell followed with the satisfied expression of someone who had seen justice properly served. When they reached him, Clay did something that would have been impossible. Months earlier, he opened his arms and gathered all three of them close, feeling the solid reality of people who had chosen to stand with him when standing mattered most. "It's over," Emma asked, her voice muffled against his coat. "It's over," Clay confirmed, though he understood now that endings were also beginnings. "Now we can start building something new." As they walked back toward town together, Clay's hand found the small velvet box in his pocket, the one containing his mother's ring, which he had retrieved along with his other restored possessions. Tonight, when the excitement had settled and the children were asleep, he would ask Mercy Calder to marry him. The man who had lost everything and found it again was ready to begin the most important chapter of his life. 6 months later, the morning sun painted Clay's restored ranch in the Judith Basin with the golden light of new beginnings. The property stretched out before them like a promise kept rolling grassland, perfect for cattle, a sturdy ranch house that Clay had expanded to accommodate his growing family, and mountain views that reminded them daily of how far they had traveled from that desperate night in Redemption Gap. The twins had adapted to ranch life with the resilience of youth and the confidence that came from finally belonging somewhere. Samuel, now 13 and growing tall like his stepfather, worked alongside Clay with the easy competence of someone born to the life. His hands, once small and uncertain, now handled rope and tools with skill that would have made his birth father proud. Emma, meanwhile, had discovered a talent for managing the household accounts and correspondence that kept the ranch running smoothly. Her careful script filled ledgers with records of cattle sales and supply purchases, while her natural diplomacy helped Clay navigate the complex relationships between neighboring ranchers and territorial officials. The schoolroom Clay had built in the ranch house's eastern wing hosted not just his own children but 6 others from neighboring families, with Emma serving as assistant teacher when the circuit instructor wasn't available. Education mattered in this family, and Clay was determined that every child in the valley would have access to learning regardless of their parents' circumstances. Mercy stood in the kitchen of their new home, her hands busy with the familiar rhythm of kneading bread, while her eyes tracked the movements of her family through the window. The silver thimble still graced her finger, but now it was joined by a simple gold band that caught the morning light like a small sun. Marriage to Clay had brought changes. She was still discovering the security of shared responsibilities, the comfort of adult companionship, and the particular joy of watching someone she loved rediscover his own worth. The quilt spread across their bed upstairs represented months of evening work, each square carefully chosen and stitched to tell the story of their blended family. Fabric from Thomas's old work clothes lay beside pieces of Clay's trail gear, while scraps from the children's outgrown garments added splashes of color that spoke of growth and change. The whole was greater than its parts, strong enough to last generations while beautiful enough to be treasured. Dr. Hartwell's monthly visits had become occasions for celebration rather than medical necessity. The elderly physician's friendship had proven invaluable during the transition from Redemption Gap to the Judith Basin, and his presence at their dinner table always brought news from the wider world along with his gentle wisdom. "The territorial capital is still talking about your case," he reported during his latest visit, settling into the chair Clay had built specifically to accommodate the doctor's aging bones. "3 federal judges have cited it as precedent in other fraud cases. You've helped more families than you'll ever know." Clay nodded his acknowledgement, but his attention was focused on Mercy as she moved around their kitchen with the graceful efficiency of someone completely at home in her surroundings. The changes in her were as remarkable as his own. The defensive tension that had marked her movements in Redemption Gap had given way to the confident ease of a woman who knew her worth and her place in the world. "Speaking of helping families," Mercy said with a smile that suggested she had been saving news for the right moment, "Dr. Hartwell has something to tell you." The physician's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of someone who had been entrusted with wonderful secrets. "Seems this household is going to need a larger breakfast table come spring. Congratulations, you two." The announcement brought Samuel and Emma running from their afternoon chores, their faces bright with excitement at the prospect of a baby brother or sister. Clay felt his throat tighten with emotion as he pulled Mercy close, marveling at how life could be so generous to those who had already received more than they dared hope for. That evening, as the family gathered in their parlor for the reading that had become their daily tradition, Clay reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The man who had sat broken in a cage, stripped of dignity and hope, now surrounded himself with love and purpose and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The ranch prospered under his management, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when good people stood together against corruption and cruelty. The neighboring families had learned to trust Clay's judgment, and his reputation for fairness and competence had spread throughout the territory. Samuel's voice carried clearly as he read from the evening's selection a passage from Mr. Dickens about the possibility of redemption and second chances. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, though they had long since stopped thinking of their story as unusual. Love, they had discovered, was the most common miracle in the world, available to anyone brave enough to recognize it when it appeared. As the children prepared for bed and Mercy banked the fire for the night, Clay stepped onto the front porch to breathe the mountain air and watch the stars emerge over his restored domain. The property deed that had been stolen and returned now rested in a safe in Helena, but the real treasure was all around him, the sound of his wife's humming from the kitchen, the children's laughter echoing from upstairs, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same blessed, ordinary happiness. The wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, reminding him that winter was coming to the Judith Basin. But this time he would meet it surrounded by family, secure in purpose, and certain that some stories really do have happy endings, not because they're perfect, but because they're true. In the morning, there would be cattle to check, and fences to mend, letters to write, and accounts to balance. There would be the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life lived well, each one given meaning by the people who shared in its doing. But tonight, Clay Lawson stood on his own land, wearing a coat made by loving hands, and understood that the most important journeys don't take you away from home. They teach you to recognize home when you find it.